Hi, my name is Hazel. This is my channel Reflect. This is where we talk about books and art and philosophy and life and creativity. Today we're going to be talking about the book that I've read this month, which is called Spring Snow by Yukio Mishima. So let's get into it. So this is basically an unusual love story. It's not a traditional love story in the sense of like romance or chemistry between the lovers or like interesting dialogue. It's none of that. In fact, the characters don't really seem to know each other beyond a surface level, the two lovers in this book, but it's still a very austere, sort of melancholic kind of love story. So the context is we're set in 1912 in Japan, which is when the Russo-Japanese War has just ended. So the Meiji era has ended and it's the beginning of the Taisho era. So for context, this is when a lot of modern values and modern lifestyle inspired by the West and intellectual ferment is sort of coming in, and this marks the end of the Japanese aristocracy and the importance of the Japanese nobility. So our male protagonist, whose name is Kyoaki, he is the son of this traditional Japanese aristocratic family. Now it's the end of that era. Kyoaki is very much unlike his ancestors, who were these traditional hard-boiled Japanese men, and he is basically someone who's very elegant and very sensitive, very prone to like melancholy, and he's someone who kind of just wants to live life for the emotions and just be guided by his emotions essentially. At the same time, living life according to his emotions doesn't mean that he's very soft or thoughtful or kind. He's still very prone to like the patriarchy of his time and the toxic masculinity, and he is prone to like hurting the ones that he loves and the ones that love him as well. So Kyoaki is surrounded by a cast of characters: his parents, his best friend Honda, who sort of just watch and kind of mold to him as he descends into this painful lovelorn hell of his own making. It is a story of unrequited love, and that's pretty obvious from like the back of the book, so it's not a spoiler. But about these side characters, everyone in this book almost just seems to mold to Kyoki's nature, in the sense that they are all present in the reality of their time, and they're kind of discomforted by how Kyoki lives his life. Like he doesn't have any direction, he doesn't have any answers, he doesn't have any questions, he doesn't know where his life is going. But he's so okay with that. He just wants to live life for the emotions and see where his emotions take him. And so the others are kind of uncomfortable, but also somewhat, at times, at least Honda, his best friend, envies that aspect of his nature, that aspect of Kyaki's nature, which is that he lives life at the extremity of human existence, and that kind of living for the emotions and being embroiled in your pain and in your own emotional torture kind of can circle back into a sort of intense joy, because you're that open and aware to not only life's circumstances and the hurdles it throws at you, but also your own inner waves of emotion. And to be that susceptible to your own heart and to your own feelings is sometimes can mean that this protagonist is someone who has this element of naivete and vulnerability and humanness that Honda at least is sometimes envious of. So there's this quote that kind of perfectly captures the way that this protagonist lives and the emotional tension that's within him, and how this is set against the backdrop of the time that he lives in, which is, you know, the end of the Meiji era, the end of the wars, and what that signals for Japan. So I'll read that out. So this is something that Honda, his best friend, is telling him. So he says, "But now that the old wars are finished, a new kind of war has just begun. This is the era for the war of emotion, the kind of war no one can see, only feel. A war, therefore, that the dull and insensitive won't even notice, but it's begun in earnest. The young men who have been chosen to wage it have already begun to fight, and you are one of them. There's no doubt about that. And just as in the old wars, there will be casualties in the war of emotion, I think. It's the fate of our age, and you are one of our representatives. So what about it then? You're fully resolved to die in this new war, am I right?" So yeah, at the same time, I would say, okay, anytime that I look here, I'm looking at my laptop, this is where my notes are. At the same time, for someone who is so susceptible to his emotions, I would say that it was ironic how stubborn Kyoki was, and how he just refused to learn from what emotions can teach you about yourself, about others. He refused to even accept or face his own emotions, and that kind of cowardice was a little frustrating to read about as a character, because he was ultimately just very arrogant and selfish and kind of a coward, a huge coward. And there's this other quote which was like a huge wake-up call. So it goes like this: Those who lack imagination have no choice but to base their conclusions on the reality they see around them. But on the other hand, those who are imaginative have a tendency to build fortified castles they have designed themselves and to seal off every window in them. This is at a point in the book where Kyoaki refuses to look at things from the perspective of his lover, whose name is Satoko, I believe, and he refuses to understand her or to like talk to her or even just see where she's coming from. And so this tendency that we have, I think most of us do, it's a lack of imagination. It's a lack of courage, ultimately, because you refuse to face others in their reality and see where they're coming from and see their point of view or like live life in their shoes for a bit. You get swept up in this fantasy, in this castle that you've built in your head of your opinions about them and who they are or what the situation is. But courage requires you, and love, I think, requires you to kind of step outside of that fantasy and come back to reality and think about other people in this reality, the people who you have interpersonal relationships with, and see things from their perspective too. All of this requires courage, which ultimately this protagonist lacked, and it was just frustrating to read about. The other thing I've written is spotted with reflections on the precariousness of life, the feeling that youth is passing you by as you're living it, while anxieties, loss, and insecurities bloom to color your whole world, and everything feels urgent and large, and somehow it feels like it will all slip away. Basically, this book is like really spotted with those kinds of reflections on youth and boyhood and this feeling that everything's just slipping away from you. And I think that as someone now who's like I'm 24, and I think that when you hit that mark of like 24, 25 and everything after that, and then when you come across such descriptions in art, in film or in books about youth and its transience and everything, it's kind of like you're swept back into what your youth felt like. And we've all felt this, which is that it feels so urgent. Every emotion, every pressing emotion, we take it so seriously because that's all we know. Whereas now, like, we have these facets of life outside of our emotions, which is like friends, family, work, our own creative pursuits, passions, and joys. But when you're in that period of like late teens, early 20s, everything is so urgent. And even society is telling you that, like, if you haven't figured it out now, you're never going to figure it out. But now you realize that there is so much time, and that's all there is. Like, there's so much time to figure things out. You will always be in those waves of figuring it out and getting lost again and then figuring it out again. But there's so much time to do that. Whereas in those moments, in that period of youth, it's like it's all slipping away, and if I don't get it now, I'll never get it. About the writing style and imagery in this book, some of the imagery and metaphors were so striking and beautiful, especially those about youth and the fleetingness of it all, I guess. That was really beautiful, but I think the way that this book was written, it was kind of this refusal to delve into the depths of characters' inner worlds and emotions, which doesn't mean that you didn't get a view of that inner world, because you can still see that the characters were well fleshed out and everything they're feeling is deep and striking and meaningful. But at the same time, there was no interplay of like the characters in our worlds with the dialogue, with the natural imagery. It was kind of like this imagery that I'm talking about. It read like it was manually set against each respective parallel scene of the characters in our world. So more than reading like an interwoven journey, it kind of read like an account of everything that was happening in this world, in this book. It was like, okay, this scene, then that scene, then that scene. So it didn't read like an interwoven journey at all. But at the same time, I feel like this could just be Mishima's style of writing. But I also saw this writing style as like mirroring what this period of Japanese living was like, or just Asian living, because it just felt relatable in terms of like the way we live, which is that we kind of refuse to see our emotions, accept our emotions, or accept the emotions of those around us. We don't communicate our feelings, so there's like misgivings and misunderstandings, and ultimately there is just this urge to get away from the truth and the meaning and the depth and the beauty of like our innermost feelings. So that was also like what this writing style, what the prose read like, because there's so much depth, but it's not interwoven, but it's kind of not staccato, but there's no delving into those depths of feeling, and there's no real flow. So the overall effect was not beautiful writing exactly, but it was still very sad and open and like striking at the same time. The things that I really didn't like about this book, which is to be expected from the time it was written in, which is that I've written the female characters are written as trophies at best, sexual objects at worst, or they're unexplored characters not given much importance. Mishima writes like a man who's never understood women or tried to and never seen them as equals. They are either strange and fascinating and inaccessible, or they are talked about as beneath man or of no consequence. So there's this slippery line between like the artist's voice and the narrator's voice, and sometimes you cannot tell which is which, but I think in this story it was fairly obvious. This is someone who maybe cannot write female characters well. So I've written that the patriarchy, tradition, expectations of society, the hollow nobility, the tension between the aristocratic traditional past and a new era struggling to emerge, the shame, the misogyny, they are all woven together in this book, where female characters aren't given a voice, aren't respected when they have a voice, and are shamed and isolated when they fight for that voice. So this is the end of the review. Overall, this was a discomforting book, at times frustrating to read, but I think that if you're into Mishima as a figure, his history is quite interesting, or if you are into learning more about like Japanese history, customs, traditions, the way that they lived back in the 1900s, that brief Taisho era, and just for the beautiful imagery at times, then this is a book worth exploring. But I would also say that this is a tetralogy, which means that there are 3 more books in this series. So this is a series that I will happily not continue to read, but if you're interested in Mishima and want to see what the hype is all about, then go for it, I guess. So yeah, let me know what y'all are reading if you want me to review any more books. And thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.